Alright guys, about ready to enter the Banksy exhibit in Miami. Let's go check it out, guys. So one of the first things you'll notice when you come in is Banksy has done a homage to Keith Haring. Keith Haring was a famous New York subway rider in the 1980s. He kind of transitioned really fast to street art, but he did kind of this chalk outlines. There would be these blank subway things, and he would draw just chalk right in there. And he drew huge crowds and became really famous doing that during the 80s. And he was really a proponent for AIDS testing because eventually he got AIDS himself and died from the disease. So another thing he did was he kind of took David from Florence, from Michelangelo, and repurposed as kind of a terrorist, which is kind of a fun play on the politics of today. Another thing, he has repurposed American comics, Charlie Brown, which is very famous, and other famous people like Mother Teresa. So it's a very typical way of Banksy working in modern imagery and repurposing his art. If you haven't seen Exit from the Gift Shop, you'll know one of Banksy's more infamous pranks was to go to Disneyland in LA and actually pull a prank with Mr. Brainwash, and he hung a Guantanamo prisoner doll on one of the rides, which shut down the whole park, or that ride, and they kind of quickly scoured and found them. But luckily they were able to smuggle the video of that out of the park and include it in the video Exit from the Gift Shop. Banksy followed this by doing his own version of Disneyland called Dismaland in, I think it was South London, I want to say. It's kind of a warehousey, dilapidated area, which obviously cheap to rent. And kind of a pun on Disneyland, how it's a perfect art and kind of cover up the reality of the world. He's kind of exposing the dirty side of the world that Disney's kind of covering up. Another part is he has kind of replicated the London subway system, which is called the Tube because they built it in a tube fashion, which is the easiest way to build a tunnel, obviously. And he has some videos on the screen of kind of the subway scene. It would have been kind of nice if they had done Mr. Robo, because they had a Robo competition with Banksy that ended really badly for Mr. Robo. But I mean, it's it's Banksy. I don't think he maybe doesn't want to reminisce about that contest that lead to the demise of Mr. Robo. One thing that was really interesting is he did a police helmet done kind of in the style of Damien Hirst, who had done an infamous skull studded in diamonds, which didn't sell well. Obviously, who wants a diamond studded skull, but obviously the prints of that sold well. So Banksy's done kind of a comical take on that, where you have this cheap disco ball police helmet. Another repurposed art was this famous nude that's in an art museum. I don't remember which one, and the girl's looking at a mirror, admiring herself, but actually she just got plastic surgery. So a take on Hollywood and kind of the extreme things people do to keep up their looks. Banksy also does a small critique on the militarism with U.S. military and other militaries that go to war repeatedly just to kind of spend money. Another interesting thing is they had some of the prints that Banksy did of currency. He made fun of the UK currency with Princess Diana on it, but it was so authentic looking that people mistook it for real currency, which, as you know, if you forge money, it's a felony, so he couldn't actually use the cash. He wanted to put it on the streets, but then because people were actually spending it, then he was afraid he's going to get in trouble, which is a real threat. You could go to prison for that because he printed, 10,000 bills or some crazy amount of these bills, which people mistook for real money, or the shop owners didn't look very carefully and spent the money. So now they're just art pieces. Another take Banksy's done is he's done a lot on consumerism. So you have the Mary Jesus with presents, or Christ on the cross with presents. So kind of a funny take on Christmas and the commercialization of a holiday. He also had a comment on a mural he recreated, which was of a parking lot with a girl swinging on the words park, which is ironic. In New York City, if you don't know, it's very paved over. I think in London you have a similar issue where there's just not many parks for kids to play in, and there's just a lot of parking lots. He's also repurposed the very famous Picasso peace dove that Picasso, if you don't know, toured with the peace dove with the communists around the world, which became kind of a propaganda move, which, obviously the Soviets and the Chinese were doing dirty kind of underground wars. I mean, the West did horrible wars in Vietnam as well, but the communists were supporting the Reds in Vietnam. So very much a proxy for the propagandists unknowingly by Picasso. They also included some of Banksy's famous monkey paintings that he sprayed around London, which I think is a kind of a commentary on the fact that humans don't really think a lot and they just kind of blindly follow their politicians or, their economic leaders or spiritual leaders around without thinking. So we're kind of like monkey brained in a lot versus logical thinking beings that we could be. Of course, what Banksy exhibit would be complete without showing the rats that he spray painted around London. They were little mini paintings that we do next to the ground where rats would live, and kind of commentary on the way human beings live and rats live, kind of incongruent with each other. There's also, if you don't know, kind of I don't know if it's a conspiracy or actually true, but Lebrec in Paris did a similar campaign before Banksy with rats, similar, not the same, but there's an argument to be made that Banksy, when he toured around France, maybe saw this and copied this and made it into his own, which he's done before with obviously other famous paintings, so it wouldn't be unheard of that Banksy copied from Lebrec. Another thing that was included was some of the pieces that Banksy snuck into historical museums that were artifacts that looked like Stone Age, and it was a very famous campaign he did where he snuck either paintings and super glued them to walls, or he brought into the prehistoric museum or the archaeological museum and had stone artifacts, and he would super glue those to the wall and they would last for a while and then fall off the wall, obviously. But it was a very famous campaign that he took pictures of and actually videotaped himself putting them up and used it later in his book. So very famous, and they include some of those in this exhibit. Another famous one Banksy did was the infamous Napoleon painting, where Napoleon painted himself in military garb on a horse riding into battle and winning. And he's done it. He's replaced it with a figure, I think, of a woman. Let me see here. I don't know if it's a woman, or I think maybe it's a woman in garb. I'm not sure, or the figure of death, but I guess he's making a commentary on that with graffiti around it. So kind of a funny take on art and how it's repurposed later by whoever is in power. There's also a lot of different artworks on the theme of war, and including war inside of classical paintings, which is ironic because at those times in those classical paintings, they were also very warlike people. It's not like they weren't. They just didn't necessarily paint all of them. Well, they did. They paint them in huge masterpiece paintings that were 20 by 30 feet or some crazy dimensions, which obviously you can't recreate and then put a modern take on it because those paintings are priceless, and they would take literally like maybe a year or two with a team of artists to finish those. So to repurpose doesn't make sense, but Banksy's taking kind of these cheesy classical paintings that people do of landscapes and put them with modern warfare machines like helicopters and troops on the ground in these paintings. So another thing Banksy took on was the Wild Wild West, which I think probably came out the same time he did this painting called The Wild Wild West, which I think is a takeoff of Will Smith's movie, which was kind of the Wild Wild West, and a black guy in the Western, which is kind of outrageous. And this is some kind of bear taking on the the UK police. And here's some of those prehistoric sculptures that Banksy snuck into the archaeological museum. So at one point Banksy has this ape, which I assume is an ode to the famous ape that got killed at the Cincinnati Museum because some idiot jumped over the fence. And one of the things with COVID happened is everyone got stuck in their own countries, so Banksy had to take a spray vacation versus traveling around, say, the Palestine and doing more artwork there. And also Banksy did one mural right outside the museum. I don't know if he did any more in Wynwood. I think he already had a few pieces up previous visits, so maybe he didn't add any to that. And that's the end of the tour for Banksy.